"Human, join me or we both die." The alien Huntress demanded Jackson's ship had been shot down over a remote alien planet, leaving him stranded in an unfamiliar, hostile environment. The planet's dense, mist-filled jungle stretched out endlessly in all directions. He had no idea where he was or why he had been targeted, but one thing was clear: he had to survive. He checked the wreckage of his ship, but there was little left. The communication system was broken, and the navigation tools were useless. His only hope was to find shelter and stay hidden until he could figure out his next move. As the days dragged on, the sense of isolation grew stronger, and Jackson's patience began to wear thin. The jungle was alive with strange sounds: rustling leaves, distant growls, and the unsettling buzz of alien creatures. Jackson knew that these woods were dangerous, but he wasn't about to go down without a fight. He tightened his grip on the rifle he had salvaged from the wreckage and began trekking through the thick underbrush. It wasn't long before he felt the presence of something, or someone, watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the feeling intensified. He slowed his pace, stepping carefully, trying not to make any noise. His heart raced. Could it be one of the hostile alien species he had heard rumors about? The Varkari, perhaps. They were known to hunt down anyone who dared to trespass on their land. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence. Jackson turned just in time to see a figure emerge from behind a cluster of trees. A tall, slender alien woman, her skin covered in shimmering scales that glowed faintly in the dim light of the jungle. Her eyes were sharp, her expression fierce, and she carried a large, deadly weapon at her side. "Human," she said, her voice cold and commanding, "join me or we both die." Jackson tensed. His instincts told him to fight, but there was something about this alien woman that made him hesitate. Her posture was confident, but there was a strange desperation in her tone. She wasn't threatening him outright. No, it was more like she was making an offer. "Who are you?" Jackson asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "I am Zarya, a huntress," she replied, her eyes narrowing. "And you're in my way. You've been marked human. If you don't join me, the Varkari will track us both down and end us." Jackson didn't know who or what the Varkari were, but he understood one thing: he didn't have much of a choice. He was alone, without backup, and the jungle was filled with dangers far worse than anything he had faced on Earth. He could feel the weight of her words, the seriousness in her eyes. "I don't even know you," Jackson said, keeping his voice level. "Why should I trust you?" Zarya studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she turned and began walking away, motioning for him to follow. "Trust is a luxury we don't have," she said. "You either join me or we both die." Jackson's mind raced as he debated his options. He had no idea who she was or what she wanted, but he could see in her movements that she was a skilled warrior, someone who had survived this planet far longer than he had. She might be his best and only chance at survival. With a resigned sigh, Jackson decided to follow her. He didn't have much of a choice. He picked up his gear and hurried to catch up, keeping a safe distance behind her as she led him through the dense jungle. The deeper they traveled, the more unnerving the planet became. The air grew thicker, and the sounds of the jungle seemed to grow louder, more aggressive. Jackson had been to some dangerous places before, but nothing compared to this alien world. He could feel the tension in the air, as though the planet itself was alive and watching them. After hours of walking in silence, they reached a small clearing. In the center was a ruined structure, an old, abandoned fortress of some kind. Zarya stopped in front of it, her eyes scanning the area. "We'll stay here for the night," she said, her tone less harsh now but still tinged with urgency. "The Varkari are smart. They won't let us rest for long, but if we fortify this position, we might stand a chance." Jackson glanced around at the remnants of the fortress. It looked ancient, its stone walls weathered by time but still sturdy. It wasn't much, but it was better than wandering the jungle at night. "All right," he said, lowering his rifle. "What do we need to do?" Zarya gave him a quick, assessing glance. "We'll set traps. And keep watch. The Varkari will be on our trail soon enough." As Jackson helped Zarya prepare the fortress for the coming fight, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a deal with someone who had her own agenda. But for now, survival was the only thing that mattered, and if that meant trusting this alien huntress, then he would. The night was cold, and the shadows seemed to stretch on forever. Jackson kept his rifle close, his eyes scanning the jungle for any sign of movement. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig made his heart race. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not here, not now. Zarya moved silently beside him, her eyes glowing faintly as she surveyed the surroundings. There was something about her that unsettled him, something that hinted at a long history of pain and survival. But Jackson couldn't afford to dwell on that. He needed answers, and he needed to stay alive. "Are you going to tell me why the Varkari are after me?" Jackson asked, trying to break the silence. Zarya didn't answer immediately. She was too busy checking the traps they had set, making sure they were in place. "Because they hunt anyone who crosses their path," she said finally, her voice low. "And you're no different. You're on their list now." Jackson's curiosity deepened, but he didn't push her for more information. Instead, he watched the dark horizon, wondering what the night would bring. Would they survive? And what was the true reason Zarya had insisted he join her? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain. He had no choice but to trust her for now. Together, they would have to face whatever dangers the Varkari and the planet itself had in store. The night passed slowly. Jackson kept watch while Zarya moved silently around the perimeter of the fortress, checking the traps they had set and ensuring that everything was in place. The cold air hung heavy, and the jungle seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something to happen. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent Jackson's senses into overdrive. He had never felt so exposed before. Zarya sat on a broken stone wall, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. Her weapon rested across her lap, ready to be drawn at a moment's notice. Jackson couldn't help but watch her. There was something about the way she carried herself, like a force of nature. She moved with purpose, as if every step she took had been planned long before she ever set foot on this planet. Jackson felt out of place, a stranger in a world that was both alien and deadly. He tried to focus on their situation. They were in a fortress that had clearly been abandoned for a long time, the stone walls crumbling with age. Yet it offered some protection from the dangers lurking outside. Jackson wasn't sure how long they could hold out here. He wasn't used to relying on someone else, especially not an alien, but right now, Zarya seemed like his best bet. "So," Jackson said, breaking the silence, "what's the plan?" Zarya glanced up at him, her sharp eyes piercing the dim light. She didn't answer right away, as if considering how much to reveal. Then, with a quiet sigh, she spoke. "The Varkari are relentless," she said, her voice low and steady. "They've hunted my people for years. They don't stop until they've wiped out every last trace of us. That's why I fight." Jackson nodded, processing her words. He had heard whispers about the Varkari during his military training, but nothing that really explained why they were so feared. To him, they were just another name in a long list of alien threats. But now, facing the reality of their existence, he understood that they were much more than that. "Why me?" Jackson asked. "Why do they want me?" Zarya didn't answer immediately. She stood up, pacing slowly as she spoke. "You were marked," she said at last. "The Varkari use a system to track anyone who crosses their path. You being here, it's no accident. You were brought to this planet for a reason, just like I was." Jackson frowned, not fully understanding. "But I don't even know why I'm here. My ship was shot down." "I was just trying to get back to my team." Zarya stopped and looked directly at him, her eyes narrowing. "You're not just anyone," she said quietly. "The Varkari think you have something they need. They won't stop until they find you, and when they do, they'll kill you." Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. His thoughts raced. Was he really in this much danger? Was he just a pawn in some alien war he didn't understand? Before he could ask more, a loud crash echoed through the jungle, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. The Varkari were already here. Zarya's expression hardened. She grabbed her weapon and signaled for Jackson to follow her. They moved quickly through the ruins of the fortress, Zarya leading the way with practiced ease. Jackson tried to keep up, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Stay close," Zarya instructed, her voice sharp. "They'll be here soon." Jackson's mind raced. What was happening? How had they found them so quickly? Were they tracking him? The jungle seemed to come alive with the sound of distant creatures, but Jackson's focus was solely on Zarya's movements. She was a seasoned fighter, and he had no choice but to trust her if they were going to make it out alive. They reached a narrow passageway in the back of the fortress, where Zarya paused to check their surroundings. Jackson caught up to her, trying to steady his breath. "Are we going to fight them?" he asked, his voice tense. Zarya nodded, her gaze steely. "We have no choice." She motioned for him to stay behind her as they crouched down, waiting in the shadows. Jackson's heart raced as the Varkari's footsteps grew louder, closer. He could hear their alien voices, low and guttural, filled with menace. They were speaking a language Jackson couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. They were hunting. Zarya gripped her weapon tighter, her muscles coiled with tension. Jackson did the same, his fingers tightening around his rifle. He wasn't used to this, being hunted like an animal. But in this alien world, survival was all that mattered. The Varkari emerged from the jungle, a group of 4 towering figures, their reptilian bodies covered in dark, spiny armor. They were armed with weapons that glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. Jackson's eyes widened in shock. These were the Varkari, the deadly hunters Zarya had warned him about. They moved with an unsettling grace, their sharp eyes scanning the area, searching for any sign of life. Zarya remained still, her body tense and ready to spring into action. Jackson's breath caught in his throat as one of the Varkari glanced in their direction. He froze, trying to remain hidden. His heart raced as the Varkari's gaze lingered on the spot where they were hiding, as though sensing something was wrong. Zarya's hand shot out, signaling for Jackson to remain quiet. The Varkari continued their search, moving closer to the fortress. Jackson's mind raced. What now? Were they going to fight? Should he risk making a move or wait for Zarya's signal? The Varkari passed within inches of their hiding spot, and Jackson could feel his muscles tense, ready to spring into action. Zarya's eyes never left their enemies, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, as if on cue, she moved. In one swift motion, Zarya launched herself at the closest Varkari, her weapon slicing through the air with deadly precision. The alien let out a hiss of surprise as it tried to block the attack, but it was too late. Jackson followed her lead, firing his rifle at another Varkari. The shot rang out, echoing through the jungle, but it only grazed the creature's armor. The Varkari hissed and turned to face him, its glowing weapon raised to strike. Zarya was already on the move, engaging the others with a ferocity that left Jackson in awe. He was a soldier trained for battle, but he had never seen anyone fight like her. She was a force of nature, unstoppable and deadly. Jackson fired again, this time hitting his target square in the chest. The Varkari let out a screech and collapsed to the ground. The remaining 2 Varkari turned their attention to him, snarling with anger. "You should have stayed hidden," one of them growled, its voice filled with malice. Jackson took a step back, his rifle raised. He had no idea if he could win this fight, but there was no turning back now. He would fight to survive no matter what. Zarya moved to his side, her weapon raised and ready. "We can't let them take us," she said, her voice steady and cold. "Fight, human, we fight or we die." With that, the battle began in earnest. Jackson and Zarya fought side by side, determined to survive, to live another day. The fight was brutal. Jackson could barely keep up with Zarya's speed and precision as she darted between the Varkari, her weapon flashing in the dim light of the jungle. He fired his rifle, each shot ringing out, but it was nothing compared to the way Zarya moved, fluid, controlled, and deadly. She was a force of nature. One of the Varkari, the largest of the group, charged toward her, swinging a jagged blade that hummed with a strange energy. Zarya parried the blow with ease, her own weapon striking with lightning speed. The Varkari hissed in pain as the blade sliced through its armor, but it wasn't enough to stop it. It raised its weapon again, aiming for her throat. Jackson didn't think. He acted. He fired, hitting the Varkari in the shoulder, knocking it off balance. It roared, swinging wildly at him with its glowing blade. Jackson ducked, barely avoiding the attack, and fired again. This time, the shot hit its chest. The Varkari staggered, blood oozing from the wound, and finally collapsed to the ground, motionless. Zarya moved on to the next enemy, her focus unshaken. Jackson felt a surge of relief. For the first time, he felt like he was actually contributing to the fight. He wasn't just a burden. He was holding his own, at least for now. The remaining 2 Varkari turned their attention to Jackson, their eyes narrowing with hate. One of them hissed, charging at him with terrifying speed. Jackson barely had time to react, raising his rifle to fire. But before he could pull the trigger, Zarya was there, her blade slicing through the air, catching the Varkari across the chest. The Varkari let out a shriek of pain but didn't fall. It reached for its weapon, its glowing spear aimed directly at Jackson. Zarya didn't hesitate. She lunged, knocking the spear aside with a swift strike before spinning to deliver a deadly blow to the Varkari's side. The creature staggered, blood spilling from the wound, but it still didn't go down. Zarya's eyes flashed with fury, and with one last swift move, she struck it through the chest, killing it instantly. The last Varkari stood frozen, watching its companions fall. Its eyes darted between Zarya and Jackson, then it hissed, its claws scraping against the stone ground as it prepared to fight. But it was too late. Zarya and Jackson moved as one, their movements synchronized, working together to corner the last enemy. Jackson fired a shot, hitting the Varkari's arm and making it drop its weapon. Before the creature could react, Zarya leaped at it, her blade piercing its throat. The Varkari let out one last strangled sound before collapsing to the ground. The silence that followed was deafening. Jackson stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe it. They had actually done it. The Varkari were dead. Zarya wiped the blood from her blade, her expression unreadable. She didn't show any sign of fatigue, despite the brutal fight they had just endured. Jackson, on the other hand, was breathing heavily, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Zarya turned to him, her eyes cold but calculating. "We've won this battle," she said, her voice steady. "But the war is far from over. The Varkari will send more. We need to move." Jackson nodded, still processing what had just happened. He had never been in a fight like that before. He had fought in wars, sure, but nothing compared to the raw violence of this planet. The Varkari were unlike anything he had ever seen. They were relentless, efficient, and cruel. "Where do we go now?" Jackson asked, his voice hoarse. "We keep moving," Zarya replied. "We can't stay here for long. The Varkari will send reinforcements. They'll track us down." Jackson felt a surge of unease. He had no idea how long they could keep running. They had barely made it out of this fight alive, and now they were supposed to keep moving without any clear plan. But he knew there was no other choice. Zarya motioned for him to follow, and they began to move deeper into the jungle. The landscape around them was dense, filled with towering trees, thick vines, and strange, glowing plants. It was beautiful in its own way, but it was also dangerous. Every step they took felt like a risk, and Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As they moved forward, Zarya remained quiet, her focus intense. Jackson tried to keep pace with her, but it wasn't easy. She moved so quickly, her senses so sharp. He had to admit he was beginning to rely on her. She knew this place, she knew how to survive. And right now, he needed her. He glanced at her as they walked, her expression still unreadable. There was something about her, something that made him wonder if she was hiding more than she was letting on. Why had she brought him into this fight? What was her real goal? "Why did you help me?" Jackson asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "You could have left me behind. I'm just some soldier. I'm not your responsibility." Zarya didn't look at him, but her voice softened slightly. "You're right. I didn't have to help you." "But I did." She paused, her gaze sweeping the jungle ahead. "The Varkari aren't the only threat on this planet. I've been alone for too long. Maybe you're not as useless as you think." Jackson raised an eyebrow, surprised by her words. He had never been good at trusting others, but something about Zarya felt different. She wasn't like the soldiers he had worked with before, the ones who cared only about orders and strategy. There was something personal in the way she fought. Something driven by a deep need for survival, but also by something else. They walked for what felt like hours, the jungle growing darker as the sun dipped below the horizon. Jackson's legs were sore, his body aching from the adrenaline and the battle. But he pushed forward, not wanting to fall behind. Zarya eventually stopped at the edge of a clearing. She scanned the area, her eyes sharp and alert. Jackson stayed close, unsure of what was coming next. "We'll camp here for the night," she said, her tone still businesslike. "Get some rest, we'll need it." Jackson nodded, setting his rifle down and sitting on the ground. He leaned back against a tree, trying to relax, but the tension in his body wouldn't let him. Every noise, every movement in the shadows made him jump. He wasn't used to this. The uncertainty, the fear. Zarya sat nearby, sharpening her weapon in silence. Her movements were steady, almost meditative. Jackson wondered if she ever got tired of all this, of the constant fighting, the endless running. "Do you ever stop?" Jackson asked quietly. Zarya didn't look up, but her voice was soft when she replied. "Stopping means dying." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the jungle around them. Jackson couldn't help but wonder what kind of person Zarya had been before all of this. What had driven her to become this warrior? He wanted to ask, but he wasn't sure if she would answer. He wasn't even sure if he was ready to hear the truth. The jungle seemed different now. It was quieter, but there was an eerie stillness in the air. Jackson had grown used to the constant sounds of the jungle, the buzzing of insects, the rustling of leaves, the distant growls of unknown creatures. But now everything felt oddly silent. It was as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Zarya moved ahead, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth with practiced ease. Jackson followed closely behind, doing his best to stay quiet. He knew the Varkari were still out there and they wouldn't stop until they found them. He could feel the weight of the threat pressing on him, and the fear was always there, lingering just below the surface. They had been walking for hours, pushing through thick vines and underbrush, and Jackson's legs were beginning to ache. His body was sore from the fight earlier, and he was starting to feel the effects of exhaustion. But Zarya didn't stop. She kept moving, her pace unrelenting, as though she had been doing this for years. Jackson didn't know much about Zarya's past, but he could tell she was different. She wasn't just surviving this place, she was living it. The jungle, the danger, the fight, it was all part of her. She was shaped by it, molded into something tougher, stronger, and more resilient than he could ever imagine. His own survival instincts kicked in when he saw Zarya stop abruptly. She raised her hand, signaling for him to be quiet. Jackson froze, his heart pounding in his chest. What was it? He scanned the area but saw nothing. The jungle seemed to be holding its breath once again. Zarya knelt down, her movements smooth and calculated. She pulled out a small device from her belt, scanning the surroundings. Jackson stayed still, watching her with a mix of curiosity and unease. "Varkari," Zarya whispered, her voice low. "They're close." Jackson's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the tension rising. They were running out of time. He had no idea how many Varkari were out there, but he knew that if they didn't move soon, they would be trapped. Zarya stood up, her eyes sharp and focused. She moved with precision, her weapon raised and ready. Jackson followed her lead, his rifle in hand, his senses heightened. The air seemed to crackle with energy as they carefully moved through the jungle, trying to avoid detection. The Varkari were masters of stealth. They could blend into the environment, moving without making a sound. Jackson had heard stories about their hunting methods, how they could track their prey across any terrain, how they would wait for the perfect moment to strike. But Zarya seemed unfazed. She knew this jungle like the back of her hand. She had survived worse. As they crept forward, Jackson couldn't help but notice how Zarya seemed so at ease. She was focused, yes, but there was a calmness to her movements that Jackson couldn't quite understand. It was as though she had already accepted that danger was a constant part of life. She didn't fear it. She embraced it. They moved for what felt like hours, carefully avoiding the Varkari patrols. Jackson was starting to wonder if they would ever find a safe place to rest. The jungle was vast, and there was nowhere to hide. They were surrounded by enemies with no way to know how many were out there. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the jungle, followed by the unmistakable sound of Varkari voices. Zarya's head snapped to the side, her eyes narrowing. She motioned for Jackson to follow her as she darted behind a large tree, her body pressed flat against the bark. Jackson quickly followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to stay quiet, moving as silently as possible, but his breath seemed too loud in the stillness. He could hear the Varkari's voices growing closer, the sounds of their feet crunching on the ground. Zarya didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly, her movements fluid and calculated. Jackson kept close, trying not to fall behind as she led him deeper into the jungle, away from the approaching Varkari. They reached a small, hidden cave, partially concealed by thick vines and bushes. Zarya signaled for Jackson to enter, and he did so without question. The cave was small but offered some protection from the Varkari outside. Zarya crouched down, her eyes scanning the jungle once more, making sure they hadn't been followed. "We stay here for now," she said quietly, her voice steady. "The Varkari are close. We'll wait until they pass." Jackson nodded, trying to catch his breath. He wasn't used to this kind of tension, being hunted, being forced to stay hidden for hours on end. He had always been a soldier, a fighter, but this was different. It was personal. It was a game of survival, and the rules were always changing. Zarya settled down in the back of the cave, her back against the cool stone. Jackson sat beside her, leaning against the wall. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the distant rustling of the jungle and the occasional chirp of an alien insect. Jackson couldn't help but wonder what Zarya was thinking. She was so focused, so determined, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. He had seen it before, the way she carried herself, the way she fought. It was all part of her survival, part of the person she had become. After a long pause, Jackson spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to you?" he asked. "Before all this, before the Valkyrie." Zarya's eyes flickered to him, and for a moment Jackson thought she might ignore him, might brush off the question like she had done before. But instead, she sighed softly, her gaze turning inward. "I was born into this fight," she said quietly. "My people were once a great civilization. We lived in peace, in harmony with the land. But the Valkyrie came and everything changed. They slaughtered my family, destroyed our cities. I fought back, but it was never enough. They kept coming, relentless, until there was nothing left." Jackson's heart ached as he listened to her story. He had known people who had lost everything in the wars he fought in, but this was different. Zarya's story was one of survival, of fighting for a future that seemed impossible. "I'm sorry," Jackson said, his voice low. "I didn't know." Zarya shook her head, her expression unreadable. "There's no need to apologize. It's not your fault. The Valkyrie don't care about us." "They never have, but I won't stop. I won't let them win." Jackson nodded. He could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that burned brighter than anything he had ever seen. She wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting for something more. She was fighting for justice, for revenge, for a future that seemed so far out of reach. "I'll help you," Jackson said quietly, his voice firm. "We'll take them down, together." Zarya didn't respond immediately, but her eyes softened for a moment. She gave him a small nod, acknowledging the promise. They had no idea what lay ahead of them, but for the first time since he had crashed on this planet, Jackson felt like he wasn't alone. The silence in the cave was deafening. Outside, the jungle stretched endlessly, a dark, mysterious world full of unseen dangers. Jackson sat with his back against the cool stone, staring into the shadows. His mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened, the Valkyrie they had fought, the endless hours of running, hiding, surviving. Zarya sat across from him, sharpening her weapon in quiet concentration. Her movements were methodical, controlled, as if she were preparing for something inevitable. Jackson watched her, a part of him admiring her strength and focus. She had lived through so much, and yet she still fought. It was something he couldn't quite grasp, but something he knew he respected deeply. "We'll move out at dawn," Zarya said, her voice breaking the silence. It was calm, almost too calm, as though she had accepted what was coming. Jackson nodded but didn't respond. He didn't need to ask where they were going. They had no choice but to keep moving, to keep fighting. There was no safe place, no place to rest for long. As long as the Valkyrie were out there, hunting them, there would be no peace. His mind went back to the conversation they had shared earlier. Zarya had told him about her past, about the destruction of her people, the endless fight for survival. He couldn't even begin to imagine what that kind of loss must feel like, what it must be like to watch everything you've ever known be wiped away by a relentless enemy. But he was starting to understand her drive. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been taken, for everyone who had suffered. The Valkyrie weren't just invaders to Zarya, they were a symbol of everything she had lost. And the more Jackson thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't turn his back on her. He couldn't walk away from this fight, not now. She had brought him into this war, and now he had no choice but to fight alongside her, even if he didn't fully understand why. "We need to take the Valkyrie's main camp down," Zarya continued, breaking into his thoughts. "If we can destroy their communications and supplies, we can cripple their ability to track us." Jackson's eyes focused on her. "How do you plan on doing that?" Zarya's lips curled into a small smile. "I've been scouting. I know where they're keeping their resources. The camp is heavily guarded, but we have an advantage. They underestimate us. They think we're weak, that we're just prey." Jackson felt a surge of confidence. For the first time since he had crashed on this planet, he felt like they actually had a chance. He wasn't just following orders anymore. He wasn't just a soldier lost in a foreign world. He was part of something bigger. And for the first time, he felt like he was standing next to someone who could actually make a difference. "We'll need a distraction," Jackson said, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "Something to pull their forces away from the camp." Zarya raised an eyebrow. "And what do you suggest?" "I'll take a small team to the east side," Jackson said. "I'll create enough noise to draw their attention. Meanwhile, you and I'll hit the main camp from the west." Zarya considered his words carefully. "It's risky. You're going alone." Jackson nodded. "I can handle it." Zarya didn't say anything for a moment, but her gaze softened. I know you can, but don't underestimate them. The Varkari are more cunning than they look. I won't, Jackson said, his voice firm. I'll be careful, but we don't have much time. Zarya sighed, the weight of the decision visible on her face. Finally, she nodded. All right. But we stick to the plan, no room for mistakes. Jackson gave a small nod in return. He could see the fear in Zarya's eyes, but she didn't show it. She was a warrior, and she had been one for a long time. She wasn't afraid to face the Varkari, no matter how overwhelming they were. For a brief moment, they both just sat there, silent, knowing that when they left this cave, they were stepping into a fight that could change everything. The Varkari were relentless, but so were they. Together, they could take them down. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Jackson stood up and strapped his gear to his back. His rifle felt heavier than usual, the weight of the mission sinking in. Zarya stood as well, her weapon at the ready, her posture as steady as ever. We'll move out in 20 minutes, Zarya said, her voice steady. Jackson nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They had a chance now, but it wouldn't be easy. It never was. They moved quickly through the jungle, using the natural cover of the trees and bushes to stay out of sight. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of wet earth and alien plants filled their nostrils. Jackson's senses were sharp as he followed Zarya, every step feeling like it could be their last. But there was no turning back now. They were committed to the fight, and they would see it through to the end. When they finally reached the edge of the Varkari camp, Jackson felt his pulse quicken. The camp was surrounded by a thick wall of tall, spiny plants, and there were guards posted around the perimeter. The Varkari were a highly organized military force, and it showed in the way they operated. But Jackson had been in enough battles to know that even the most disciplined force could be outsmarted. Zarya crouched down beside him, her eyes scanning the camp. You go now, she whispered. I'll wait for your signal. Jackson gave her a determined look. Stay sharp, I'll be back soon. With that, he crept away, moving silently through the underbrush. He knew he had to make it to the east side without being seen, where he would create the distraction. He had one shot at this, and he couldn't afford to fail. The success of their mission depended on it. The Varkari guards didn't see him coming. Jackson was quick and quiet, slipping past them like a shadow. He reached the eastern side of the camp, where a group of Varkari soldiers were gathered around a campfire. He took a deep breath, raised his rifle, and fired a single shot into the air. The shot echoed through the jungle, followed by a loud shout from one of the Varkari soldiers. Jackson quickly disappeared into the trees, his heart racing as the Varkari scrambled to respond. He had their attention now. The distraction had worked. He ran, weaving through the jungle, using the chaos behind him to cover his movements. His mind raced, counting the seconds, knowing that Zarya would be moving in on the west side now. The Varkari would be scattered, but they wouldn't stay distracted for long. They were smart, but they were also divided. Jackson reached the rendezvous point and waited, listening carefully for the sound of footsteps. He knew Zarya would be close. They had a job to finish. It wasn't long before he saw her appear from the trees, her eyes scanning the area. She gave him a brief nod, confirming that the west side was secure. Together, they moved quickly into the heart of the Varkari camp. The battle was fast and intense. Jackson and Zarya fought side by side, their movements in sync, each strike decisive and calculated. The Varkari, caught off guard, struggled to regroup, but it was too late. The damage had been done. By the time the Varkari managed to send reinforcements, Jackson and Zarya had already destroyed their communication systems, taken out their supplies, and crippled their ability to track them. The Varkari were defeated, at least for now. As the smoke from the battle cleared, Jackson and Zarya stood together, breathing heavily but victorious. They had won this fight, but there was still much more to be done. The Varkari wouldn't stop, but neither would they.